to today's Talks on Tuesday. We are going to be talking about using augmentative and alternative communication in early intervention. Part 1, AAC Explained and Myths Busted. So my name is Megan Wright, and I am a speech-language pathologist at Children's Hospital of Richmond at VCU at our Brook Road campus. I am part of our assistive technology team that evaluates and treats children with complex communication needs for augmentative and alternative communication. And this webinar is the first part of a two-part series. And the whole thing is going to talk about AAC and how to use it with the EI population. Carrie Hastings is the other presenter who will be presenting the second part in early October. So welcome everybody. I have a couple of learning objectives for us today. Our first one is to define AAC and the key components of it, understanding high versus light tech AAC systems, and also being able to dispel two myths about using AAC with toddlers. So I want to do a little poll here about who is here with us today. So we're going to use that poll tab that Corey had talked about earlier, and I want you to let me know if you're a speech therapist, OT/PT, early educator, or if you are other.
So as a reminder, if you're looking for the poll feature, it is the little A box right under your name, and you pull out the drop down to decide which A, B, C, D, or E.
All right, I'll give everybody another 5 to 6 seconds. All right. Jeannie, do you mind putting out our poll feed? Okay. So it looks like we have a couple speech therapists, we have a PT, we have a few early educators, and then it looks like we have some others. If you don't mind using the chat feature for a second to just so we can find out what other professionals we have here. All right, Catherine is a nurse. Welcome. Education coordinators, service coordinators, developmental specialists. Great. Thank you all and welcome. I am also glad that you are here. So I want to do another and a social worker. Thank you, everybody. I also want to do an experience poll to find out how much experience you all have with augmentative and alternative communication. So I want you to use your pointer tool and drop down. If you think you have no experience whatsoever, you put that on the red. If you have some moderate experience, that's going to be more towards the yellow. And then if you have a lot of experience using AAC, putting your pointer on the green. All right, I'll give a couple more seconds. Great, thank you everybody for participating. So it looks like we have the majority of people here with some experience, and then a couple of people with a little bit more experience using AAC. But regardless of your experience, I hope that you all learn something that you can take with you to share with coworkers, to share with caregivers, or even for your own experience in your professional role. So let's move on to what is AAC. You will hear me throw out the term AAC a lot throughout this presentation, and what it stands for is Augmentative and Alternative Communication. It includes all forms of communication other than oral speech that are used to express our thoughts, our needs, wants, and ideas. We all use AAC day to day when we make facial expressions or gestures, when we use symbols or pictures, or even when we write. So just take a moment to think about the different types of AAC that you use day to day. For example, writing down notes in your agenda, texting a friend, emailing a coworker, or even waving hello to somebody down the hall. Let's also think about things in our environment that are also considered AAC, such as symbols that have specific meanings, like stop signs and crosswalks and traffic lights. These are ways that we communicate with each other when we need to do something. So there's a specific meaning behind these symbols that doesn't require us to know what they are just from verbal speech. They stand for themselves. And thinking about individuals with severe speech or language problems, they often rely on AAC to supplement the speech that they do have, or sometimes even replace speech that is just not functional for them to be functional communicators. So there are different components to AAC. AAC is truly multimodal. It permits individuals to use every mode possible to communicate. So it is not just about the type of AAC that you're using, but also about the strategies and the techniques that go into using it successfully to communicate. AAC is not just a device, and it's not just a picture board. It doesn't just refer to a various type of non-speech mode or system of communication, but also a range of strategies and intervention techniques. So thinking of young children, we often use a variety of AAC, and we call this total communication. So a child may have some verbal speech, they may use some signs or pictures or gestures, and using all of these modalities allows them to communicate their messages in the quickest and easiest way possible so that they can communicate in that moment. And I mean, think about it day to day, just like we talked about before. We are all total communicators. We all use a variety of tools to help us communicate and be functional. So we want to make sure that we provide these same tools and opportunities and strategies for young children so that they can be successful as well. We break down AAC into two different categories. We have unaided AAC and we have aided AAC. Unaided AAC is when we rely on the user's body to convey the message. So examples would include gestures, body language, and or sign language. Nonverbal gestures can really speak for themselves. If you take a look at the child on the left-hand side of the screen, she is communicating a lot to us just by her body language. She doesn't even need to supplement that with verbal speech because we can kind of tell how she's feeling. And then we have aided AAC systems, which require the use of tools or equipment in addition to the user's body. And so that you'll see on the right-hand side is a little boy using a tablet. So AAC is broken down, aided AAC is broken down further into three categories. We have no-tech solutions, which are any readily available items, such as a paper and pencil that we can jot something down on. A light-tech system, which is a picture board or a textbook, or even a voice output device that has to be programmed by a caregiver and doesn't have very many options. Or we have a high-tech solution that is always speech generating and produces voice output and may include multiple methods of access. So you hear now with technology changing daily, there's lots of different ways for individuals that have complex bodies to be able to communicate even if they can't use their hands. For example, eye gaze technology, where people can use a high-tech device to communicate with their eyes. So I want to get some involvement from you all just to kind of see where we're at thinking about aided AAC examples. What I want you to do is I want you to draw a circle around the items that you consider light tech devices. And you're going to use your little drawing tool to do this.
This is Corey. If you need help finding your drawing tool, it is the third item down on your toolbar. It looks like a little pencil or crayon. There you go.
All right, perfect. I'm going to give you all 5 more seconds. Okay, so thank you everybody for participating. I'm going to use my little pointer so that we can kind of talk about which ones are light tech and which ones are no tech and which ones are high tech. So it looks like a lot of you have circled the light tech devices. So this one right here where my pointer is considered a light tech device. It does have voice output, but there's templates that you have to put inside and that the caregiver has to record their voice. This is a textbook. It is also a light tech system. It doesn't have voice output, it just has pictures, and the child moves the pictures as needed to communicate. This one down here is a Big Mac switch, so this has a limited amount of voice output. There's only one message that you can say at a time, depending on what type of switch it is. And then this one is a Pocket Go Talk, and it's similar to this one up here in the middle. You record your own voice, but again, there's a limited amount of words that are going to be accessible on this device. So we had a couple people circle the paper and notepad, and this one is actually not light tech. This one is considered no tech because it's a readily available item that anybody can go out in the community and buy and use. And then this one up here at the top is actually an iPad with a communication application, and this is actually considered high tech as well. Because again, it has a very robust language system, and as you press different icons, it takes you to different pages and it speaks for you. All right, so thank you again for all participating. We are going to move on. So it is 2017 now, and children that are at risk for complex communication disorders are identified earlier. There's early intervention services that are fairly widely available, and the materials, strategies, and technology for communication is changing and improving daily. So the big question is, why don't young children use AAC? Why don't we see this population with AAC more frequently? And here's why. There are several AAC myths that surround the use of AAC for this population. And these are unfounded misconceptions that have been existing for decades, which often prevent people from even investigating the possibility of how AAC might help them or somebody that they know. And these misconceptions continue to be perpetuated by multiple professions and people, including caregivers, educators, and even speech-language pathologists. So what we're going to do today is we are going to debunk these myths and talk about why they are not true and why it's important to know that these myths are not true. Our first myth is that AAC will negatively impact verbal speech and language skills. So I want you all to use your raising your hand tool to let me know if you have heard any of the following. So raise your hand if you have heard that introducing AAC will reduce a person's motivation to improve natural speech and will hinder language development.
And if folks are looking for the raise your hand tool, it is right under your name. It's the third box from the left, and it looks like a little hand. Just click on that.
Okay, I'm going to give people 5 more seconds. All right, so it looks like quite a few of you have heard this myth. How about this one? Raise your hand if you have heard that AAC should be introduced only after the ability to use natural speech has been completely ruled out. All right, I'll give people 5 more seconds. Okay, so it looks like quite a few have heard this myth as well. And if you've heard either of these myths, you may have heard somebody make comments or statements such as, we don't want him to rely on his device, or we're going to wait and see if her speech develops. Maybe you've heard someone say, he talks a little bit, or I can understand what he says. So let's talk about why this is false. And we're going to take the first part of this myth that AAC reduces motivation to improve natural speech and hinders language development. So there are research studies that have looked at children before, during, and after the introduction of AAC. And a review of these looked at individuals aged 2 to 60 years old and was completed by Miller, Late, and Schlossler in 2006. And this study showed that 89% of children that used AAC had an increase in speech, and 0% of them had a decrease in the amount of speech that they had prior to use of AAC. So like I mentioned previously, you may have heard someone say, we don't want him to rely on his device. Typically, a child can get what he or she wants in the fastest way with verbal speech. So if a child is going to develop verbal speech, using AAC will not keep this from happening because they're going to say what they want instead of going to their device if they're able to. And using AAC can actually help with verbal speech. This is true. We have seen this in the research studies. And some of the reasons behind this is that there is a consistent auditory model. The child uses a device or uses a picture and they get that consistent model over and over and over, whether it's from the device itself or the adult saying it. There's also a decrease in communicative pressure. So the child isn't worried about having to say certain words if it's really hard and if it gets frustrated, but they can use something else to help them supplement what verbal speech they don't have. To continue talking about why this is false, AAC also allows children to learn language despite them not being able to produce verbal speech. So using AAC can help a child learn and help adults model new grammar and longer utterances that a child is more readily able to imitate and that fits with their receptive understanding than what they can say verbally. It allows them to explore new language and words, even if they don't know what they mean yet. But the way that we respond to what they say with AAC is going to be how they learn new vocabulary and how they learn how to combine words. So it also helps children to develop social skills because it gives them opportunities to communicate with new and old people. If only mom ever understands what they say, they might not want to talk to grandma or a friend at school, but if they have a backup or a supplement to their verbal speech, then it might open that door for them to be able to talk to other children or other family members that usually don't know what they're saying. And thinking about the second part of the myth, that if a child has a small amount of speech, AAC is not necessary. So why is this false? We need to think about the child and determine if their needs are being met through what verbal speech they have. A typically developing child is constantly experiencing new things and developing that vocabulary to match their experiences. So we have to think about if this child in question, if their verbal speech can keep up with what cognitive gains they're having. We also want to think about, is it the child's own message, or is it something that she's just repeating from an adult or from a TV show? And then also, how intelligible is this child? Can she be understood by less familiar people? Because again, we don't want to rely on having familiar people have to translate for what that child is trying to say. And the bottom line really is that just because that child has some verbal speech does not automatically mean that it's functional communication. We really have to make sure that what that child has is functional and that they can communicate with a variety of people in a variety of environments. All right, so why is this important, knowing that this myth is false? It's important because we don't have to choose between verbal and AAC. Often you'll hear people say, you know, we want to still work on verbal speech, so we don't want to do AAC. But you really don't need to choose. You can continue to work on verbal speech, but supplement what they have with AAC, because we really need to provide a way for these children to communicate immediately. Verbal speech can easily be supplemented with AAC. Think about what you've done today. You've already used text messages. You've already written notes. You've already sent emails. So we do this on a day-to-day basis. And so again, we want to make sure that these children are also successful. So we need to make sure we give them the tools. And though the direct aim of using AAC is not necessarily to develop verbal skills, the goal of AAC is actually to be a functional communicator. Verbal speech does often develop when using AAC, and it's just a nice bonus when that does happen. All right. So again, why is this important? Limited verbal abilities don't have to equal limited language abilities. So the quality and the quantity of language can be improved through AAC. We don't want to limit what a child's able to do just because we want to wait to introduce AAC. It should be introduced as soon as speech isn't sufficient to meet that child's needs. We also don't want to delay language through a wait-and-see approach, because we don't want to have to play catch-up later. And often we hear families or other professionals say, well, how do we know how long to wait? And really, there's no official age at which verbal speech can be ruled out. We might be waiting forever, and so this is why it's important to provide these children with a way to communicate as soon as we can. A child may have limited verbal abilities, but they may be able to develop their language more quickly using AAC. And a nice example of this is a child who may only be able to produce one word approximation may be able to produce an age-appropriate phrase when they're taught using AAC. And a big part, especially with this population, is that we know that what a child learns in their first 3 years of life is crucial for their development and their success down the road. So we don't want to limit their communication potential just because they don't have functional verbal speech. So that's a big point to think about when you're working with this early intervention population. So we have a video here. We're not going to actually watch this video today. The link is provided on your handouts. And I'm just going to give a quick background and some things for you to look for when you actually watch this video later. This is a child who's using an iPad with a communication application called Proloquo2Go. So this is considered a high-tech device. He participated in a study for 6 months receiving speech therapy with the use of AAC. And so when you watch this video, I want you to ask yourselves and kind of look out for the following questions. How is this child communicating at the beginning of the study? How many words is he using? How functional is his communication? I want you to think about how is he communicating by the end of the study? Is his communication more functional? Has using AAC hindered his language development? And lastly, does he seem to rely on his device towards the end of the study? So those are just some things to think about as you're watching this video later on. And like Jeannie put on the chat, she has the link, and then also the link is available in your handouts. All right, so we are going to move on to our next myth. Our second myth is that prerequisite skills are required to use AAC. So I want you to raise your hand if you have heard that statement, that prerequisite language skills are required to use AAC. All right, it looks like we've got several people that have raised their hands. And how about the next myth? Have you raised your hand if you have heard somebody say individuals with cognitive deficits are not able to use AAC? All right, great. So it looks like there are about 8 people that have heard that myth. So if you've heard somebody say, agree with this, you may have heard them make statements like, we can't start doing this yet. He or she just isn't ready. Or he or she doesn't have the attention to communicate. You may unfortunately have heard the term, he or she is just too low. Or he or she doesn't seem to want to communicate with others. So let's talk about why this is false. Communication can actually help to expand cognitive skills. The development between cognitive and language skills is very complex. There are some foundational cognitive skills to develop language skills. For example, we have cause and effect. So this is if I do a certain thing, such as an action, make a noise, etc., something's going to happen. So if I push this button on this toy, the lights are going to come on. There's another skill called means end. This is the understanding that a certain word or action or behavior will result in a desired outcome. So for example, a child says the word cookie and mom gives them a cookie. Or a child gestures and puts their hands up in the air and then mommy picks them up. They've learned that these certain words or actions are going to give them a desired outcome. And then lastly, object permanence, which is that something is no longer visible, but knowing that it still exists. So for example, mom put the cookies in the cabinet, but I know they're still in there even if I can't see them. These examples are foundational cognitive skills for developing language, but they can also develop at the same time that a child is learning how to use language or how they're using to learn AAC. And think about it, some language skills can actually precede cognitive skills. So for example, a baby is babbling mama, mama, but they're not connecting the meaning behind it until we give them a reaction. Oh, you said mama, you're right, that's me. They're learning that connection, that cognitive connection between what they're saying and that there's meaning behind it. And so individuals with cognitive impairments also need to communicate their wants and needs. And so even if they don't have some of these foundational skills, they can still be learned while we're also helping them to learn language. All right, so we're going to do a little true or false right now to talk about why it is important to know that this myth is not true. So what I want you to do is I want you to use your pointer tool to make your selection and either put it on the true or on the false. So our first one is that children with cognitive impairments can't learn if we don't teach them. And I wrote the true or false down in the chat if you needed a reminder of what it was.
If you need, it looks like people are finding their pointer tool. It is the second button down on your toolbar.
All right, so it looks like we've got some participation. Thank you, everybody. Children with cognitive impairments can't learn if we don't teach them. This is true, especially with AAC. We can't just expect that a child is going to be able to learn what to do with AAC if we don't give them the proper tools to learn. We need to give them opportunities to show us what they know and what they need help with. So let's move on to the next one. The next one, I want you to let me know if you think that this is true or false. When using AAC, we must start with something simple, like pictures or switches. Again, I wrote it down in the chat if you needed a reminder of what the question was. All right, great. So this one, when using AAC, we must start with something simple like pictures or switches. This one is actually false, which it looks like a lot of you had picked. So for this one, we need to make sure that we're presuming competence. This means that we're giving the child the opportunity to show us what they know. We don't know what a child is capable of if we don't give them the opportunity to show us. And so we don't have to start with low tech. Some of these children might do really well with a high-tech device, and we just don't know that until we actually give them the opportunity to show us. And so often in our evaluations, we may start with something high-tech to find out if the child is able to use this type of device because we're presuming competence so that they can show us what they know and what they're able to do. And then if using a high-tech device is hard for them, then we might try something a little bit more simple. All right, and our last true and false is true or false, a child does not have to be an independent communicator immediately. All right, I'll give everybody about 3 more seconds. Perfect. So we got a lot of truths, and that is correct. Modeling is a very important aspect in learning how to communicate verbally and also how to communicate with AAC. So let's think about a typically developing child. It takes some children over a year to begin using words. And so we can't expect that a child learning to use AAC is going to know how to use it immediately. We need to model and teach them just like we do for verbal communicators. Verbal communicators hear words over and over and over again before they start to use them. And children using AAC, it's the same. We need to know that it's not going to happen overnight, but that it does take time, and we have to model communication using AAC for them so that they can learn how to communicate back to us. And Carrie is going to get into kind of the implementation of how to use AAC in the second part of our series in October. So that'll be touched on a little bit more then as well. So this is a video example that we actually are going to watch today. I wanted to give you a little bit of background first before we start this. But this is a family that has had several children with complex communication needs, and they use POD books, which stand for Pragmatically Organized Dynamic Display Books. These are considered light tech supports because they're books full of pictures and full of symbols, and they they do offer a robust vocabulary system. So the child does have to rely on a communication partner because the partner is going to be the one that flips the pages for them because there's a lot of words in there. But it does give them the opportunity and gives them access to a lot of words. So I want you to think about, while you're watching this video, a couple of key points. So I want you to think about how mom is modeling language to the child. I want you to think about how the child, her name is Harper, how she initiates communication with her mom, and then also how mom reacts to help the child learn language. So those are a couple of things I want you to think about as we're watching this video.
Everybody, this is Corey, and we don't do videos very often, so just a quick reminder, the video, when we get it started, is going to show up on a separate window. It might be in front of your Blackboard, the picture you're seeing right now, or it might be behind it. So you just need to find it and then return back to the Blackboard pane to continue with the webinar. It's important that you remember to unmute your speaker so that you can hear the video. And when you are finished, if you will use the raise your hand feature, because everybody has different bandwidth speeds on your computer, we'll kind of be watching to know when you are finished. So, okay, Jeannie, go ahead. Just a reminder to please raise your hand.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So thinking about what we talked about prior to this video about how mom was modeling language to the child. So you saw that she pointed to the pictures while she was talking to Harper so that Harper was seeing that model of how to use AAC. And then mom was the one that was flipping the pages as Harper pointed to what picture she wanted. How she initiated communication was she has a little picture that says, I have something to say. And so she points to that when she wants her mom to get her communication book, which is another thing that we need to think about when we're teaching children with AAC is, especially when they do have complex bodies, having a way for them to be able to initiate communication so that they don't just have to rely on us to go get their book or to make sure that their device is in front of them. Because, you know, oftentimes it might not be right in front of them and they might need to tell you something. So just kind of thinking about a way that these kiddos can initiate communication. And then also just kind of thinking about how mom reacted to Harper when she said certain things, and then how she actually expanded on Harper's language by telling her, oh, you don't like it. Maybe you think it's scary. Maybe you're bored. So that's something else that we do too, just like we do with verbal communicators, is how we are going to teach these children that are also using AAC. And I have a question. How did you determine pictures I want to go? So what Harper did was actually point to a picture that said, let's go. And so then on the bottom there's a tab that says go. And so mom flips to the page that corresponds with let's go so that she can get to the right page. And so POD is the book that she was using. There's extensive training in how to use it. So it's you know, it's not something that you can just pick up and know how to use right away. It's something that you go through training to figure out how to use it correctly. And then how old is the little girl and what is in her mouth? I am not sure what is in her mouth. I think that she either grinds her teeth or bites down often or mouths things, so she has that in her mouth. Yeah, it does kind of look like a chewy, just to kind of keep her stabilized and so that she won't grind her teeth. And I'm not sure her exact age, but she has been using this system since she was adopted, since they've had her. I believe she's in this video between 2 and 3. I don't know if mom ever explicitly said, but she's been using POD ever since she's been with this family. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide, which is about presuming competence. And I mentioned this earlier. It's really important that we presume competence with these kiddos, and I think that this is the perfect picture to kind of sum up that. We need to give these children the opportunity to show us what they can do. And there is a famous in the world of assistive technology speech therapist, I should say very well known, named Gail Van Tatenhove. And she said the following quote, which I think is perfect. She said, use of 2 words and then 3 to 4 words and word endings happens in typically developing kids before the age of 3. So it is not asking too much for kids using AAC to be given the same opportunity for language learning. While all children using AAC are not going to reach the same levels of language proficiency, all children using AAC should be given the opportunity to reach for their highest personal level of language proficiency. So basically, she's just saying that we don't know what these kids can do until we give them the opportunity to show us. They may not be as proficient in language as some other children that use AAC or some verbal children, but we don't know what they're able to do if we don't give them the support and the tools to help them be successful communicators. So that is what presuming competence means, especially in AAC. So what I want to do next is just kind of talk about a real life example in experience that I have had. And this child has a diagnosis of 22q deletion and potentially had childhood apraxia of speech as a diagnosis when he was first seen for therapy. And if you need more information about either of these diagnoses, please just raise your hand or write in chat, and I can talk about them a little bit more. But this child started receiving speech therapy around the time that he was 1 year, 8 months old. His language skills were tested, and he had normal receptive language skills, but he produced only one syllable for everything. So he used the word da for mom. He used the word da for dog and dad and ball. So you can see how it would be difficult to know what it was he was communicating, especially when it was out of context. If he said da and pointed to mom, you know, it's a little bit easier to know, oh, okay, he's talking about mom. But if mom wasn't in the room and he wanted to see mom, it's very hard to know what it was he was trying to communicate. So he was introduced to a high-tech technology device pretty quickly within therapy. And this happened because we were presuming competence with him, and also his language skills were rapidly growing. So he needed a way to kind of keep up with his receptive language skills. So we introduced a device for him. And with AAC, he was able to combine 2 words together, and he continued to expand his utterance length over time. He was able to have typical expressive skills with AAC. He started learning to combine words into different ways. So maybe he would say, go car, or he would say, dad go, or go there, you know, to go somewhere. So he was using the same word in lots of different ways because he was able to and had access to it. He began using pronouns and nouns and different verbs and even some grammatical endings. So because he had access to many more words, he was able to say so much, and it took the pressure off of him having to communicate verbally, and there was less frustration seen because he was able to express himself. And so by the time he was 2 years, 8 months, his skills had improved tremendously with using AAC, but also his verbal skills had improved tremendously. He heard that model consistently, and he had this device in therapy, but he also had one at home, so it was with him all of the time. And because he was hearing that verbal model over and over and over, his verbal skills also were noted to improve. And he is now actually 4 years old and is being seen in an outpatient clinic solely for articulation. He's not really using his device much more unless there's a word that's really hard for him to say, because his verbal speech has improved so much and is really starting to match his receptive capabilities. So this just kind of goes to show you that introducing AAC to this child improved his verbal skills. Like we said, it's not the aim, but it was a nice bonus. He was no longer relying on his device now that he was able to use his verbal skills. And this was introduced to him very early on so that he was able to grow his expressive skills as his receptive skills continued to grow. And I got a question, which device does he use? He used the Accent 800 by Prinky Romic Company, and he was on a sequence language user, 84 icons. So he had lots and lots of vocabulary words on there. And again, he used this across context. So he used it at home and he used it in therapy. So he was given exposure. And again, it wasn't something that happened immediately. It happened over time. And it just goes to show you that, this provided a really positive impact for this child, that if maybe he hadn't had exposure to AAC, his skills would probably be a little bit further behind. And so I just thought that was a really nice real-life example to share with you all. And so last we are to our question and answer portion of our presentation. So if you have a question, feel free to write it into chat, and I will try to respond to as many questions as I am able to. All right, so I got a question. How do we help get funding for families? So this is, of course, a difficult question. I provided a resource list with the PowerPoint that has lots of different resources for finding out about funding. It depends on what device the child is going to get. It also depends on what insurance they have. Insurance companies have a portion of insurance for durable medical equipment, and often AAC devices are included. So they will be covered by family member or by insurance companies for some insurances. Other insurances are a little bit trickier to get devices. And then for low-tech or light-tech devices and devices such as like an iPad, it has to go through a DME vendor who's the one that works with a case manager and then gets the quote from insurance to cover that way. So Jeannie put in the resources. There's a lot more information. There's also some information about for the representatives for a couple of the different devices that we use. And so you can ask them about other funding options. Same with case managers. If you know any case managers or the family has a case manager, asking them about different funding options. But that is, of course, the tricky part about the AAC. And I have another question. Did you work specifically on verbal speech at the same time as working with the AAC, and if so, how? Yes, we did. We worked on small syllables at first, being able for him to increase the amount of phonemes that he had, in isolation. And then in small syllables, we did do a lot of like drill activities, but then as we were having conversations, he would use his AAC device to communicate back. If he said something verbally, that was wonderful. I then wouldn't make him use his device to tell me again. And oftentimes, there were just certain words, like the word go, that he heard over and over that I didn't even specifically work on that word, that he kind of just started producing on his own. So, we still in therapy worked on verbal speech and AAC, but especially in the beginning when he was very difficult to understand, most of the session conversations were using AAC, and then simultaneously we would take little breaks and work on the verbal speech as well. I have another question. Are pod books as effective as electronic, and is there an app? So there actually is an app for a pod book. It is through the Tobii Dynavox device series of devices, and let's see. And oftentimes kids you learn to use the book first, and then the family may transition to the application. Something nice about having the pod book itself is that it's something that can just be made, and so then the family doesn't have to worry about funding or worry about some of those other issues with getting a device. And it's something that often is modeled extensively for receptive language before the child even starts to use it expressively. And so, it just depends, thinking about the benefits of that versus the electronic. It just kind of depends on the child and what the child is able to do. Again, if you don't have access to a high-tech device, I think starting with something like tech like that, just to get the child at least introduced to something and a way for them to communicate is really important. So kind of thinking about it from that angle also. Let's see our next question. Do you have any problem with getting parents to buy in when children are so young? Actually, yes. Recently, I had a child for an evaluation whose mom basically said all of the myths that we just talked about earlier today, and we talked about them, and then we had the child use a device, and he actually used a high-tech device in the evaluation, an Accent 800, and once mom was able to see it and see what he could do with it, so he started using a couple words on there, like the word eat and the word go that he wasn't saying verbally, and then actually, after he had used them on the device a couple times, he started saying eat out loud. And so mom was able to kind of see that even in the evaluation. And so she was a lot more on board with doing a trial of a device to see if it is something that would help. She was also kind of concerned about him looking different. And so once she saw some of the updated technology and how they look very similar to a tablet or an iPad, that kind of helped her too. But I think that unknownness of what AAC is and what it looks like, and showing families that they look very similar to an iPad that another child is carrying around, especially with the high-tech devices, that kind of makes the family less scared that their child's going to look different from other children. And then let's see, another question here we've got, how does coaching work into this when there is so much direct teaching involved? So coaching is something that we do a lot of, and actually that's a really great question. It's going to be talked about a lot in Carrie's presentation in early October, so I'm not going to talk about this too much, but we do use a coaching model to get caregivers and other family members involved in using the devices. We don't teach them initially a lot about programming because we want them to get in there and just start using the device. We talk about different routines that they can use it in. We talk about different activities that they can use it in. And so we kind of break it down for them and have them use it in front of us so that we can give them any tips and pointers. And often if families don't feel that comfortable with modeling in front of us, because that happens sometimes, we tell them to take a video of you using the device and modeling with the child at home so that we can kind of see what's happening in day to day and give you some other strategies for how to incorporate the device. Like I said, Carrie is going to talk about that a lot more in October, so if you're really interested in that, I definitely recommend that you also attend that webinar. And then it looks like we have one more question. What did the picture look like that conveyed I have something to say? It was a little picture, I think it was a board maker picture that was a little mouse that had like lines coming out of it. And then at the top it just said, I have something to say. So what the mom did in that situation was every time she has something to say, she'll point to the picture to show her child, oh, I have something to say, touch the picture, and then she gets out the book to show her. So kind of teaching that initiation the same way that we're going to teach the child how to communicate with their AAC, showing them, oh, this is how you're going to let me know that you have something to tell me. And so the mom just models using that every time she wants to initiate communication with her child as well. So I think that's all of the questions that we have for now. I just wanted to say thank you all so much for coming to this webinar and for participating and asking all these questions. Like I said, I hope that you got some tips, some helpful knowledge for you to take back to the families and to coworkers and other professionals. And like I said, Carrie will be presenting on October 3rd for the second part of our series, which is going to talk about a couple more myths and then also strategies and coaching that we use to teach AAC.
Yeah, this is Corey. I just want to thank you for such an informative Talks on Tuesday. If folks have any additional questions that you did not get in, feel free to type them in chat. I'll be leaving the chat open for another minute or two, and we can get those to Meg. As a reminder, you are automatically registered for the October 3rd Talks on Tuesday, but we have space. So if you've got lots of good information and you want to invite colleagues, you are welcome to do that. So thank you all. Meg, thank you again, and I hope everybody has a nice afternoon. We'll see you in October. Bye-bye.